everyone, welcome to the new show. It's called Around the Chessboard. It's the pilot in a series of shows we have planned, and the purpose of the show really is to provide an antidote to censorship. In the era where people are being controlled by unbalanced media, open and free discussion is the antidote really. My name is Rob DeSalle. I was involved in fighting medical coercion. My guests today are David O'Reilly. How are you doing, David?
Good, lovely sunny drive up to see you, and it's great to be here.
Yeah. David is a well-known activist. A lot of people might know him. And Darragh Flaherty. How are you doing, Darragh?
How's things? I'm good. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to be here, lads. So I suppose we want to start with the COVID situation. You know, I wanted to ask you, Darragh, what are some of the characters you've seen that emerged during this COVID operation? And I call it an operation. We absolutely do believe that COVID is real. Many of us have suffered from it, but that a lot of the purposes of it seem to be controlled with the media. So what are some of the characters you've seen that have emerged?
You mean political characters or
political characters, everyday life?
Yeah, I was actually more surprised by the characters I missed. I really underestimated the effect that this had on the youth, and it's only become apparent to us in the last couple of months when the youth felt they could express themselves more and come out more and talk to us. There was really a huge amount of suffering in our youth. Yeah. And I'm very surprised at myself that I missed it. That I didn't, I guess I had it figured in my head, but I didn't see it in front of me. I didn't see it around me. And I'm disappointed that I missed it. And I want to apologise to you, the youth, because of that, and the elderly. I really didn't play my part as well as I could for you guys. I spoke to the mainstream and I tried to influence the mainstream, but really there was a huge amount of suffering that just went unseen, unheard, and it was mainly in our young people and our elderly who were isolated from the networks that they completely depend on. You see, you and I don't completely depend on our networks. We're independent people, we move around, we do things. But the young people require their friends groups, and the old people require their family groups. And without them, their lives were just, what we're hearing is very, very sad.
Yeah. And you know, a short few weeks ago, we were in the darkest days of medical apartheid here in Ireland. We had unvaccinated people were restricted from visiting loved ones in healthcare settings. We had unvaccinated people, and I hate using that term, but they were being excluded from most aspects of day-to-day life, including reports of being denied access to healthcare and doctor's appointments, you know, often by stealth. It wasn't really declared, but it was just happening under the table. You know, people were being asked when they were calling for an appointment were they vaccinated or not, and then when they said that they weren't, they failed to get an appointment. You know, and all of this was written into law. So where are we now, Darragh, and how do we right these wrongs?
Well, we have to push for something that the Irish people aren't used to pushing for, which is accountability. The phraseology that was used by our politicians and media is it's exactly the phraseology in the Weimar Republic. It's exactly the kind of nudging towards tyranny and genocide that has gone on in every tyrannical regime in history. Mm-hmm. For a TD to stand up and recommend camps for people who refuse to undergo medical procedures, you know, that's extremely dangerous. For radio presenters, I won't mention any particular name, but for those radio presenters to listen to them recommend that I be violently injected with a chemical that they had no idea of its effect of, and which we have since confirmed what we were saying was actually poison. So, you know, that was bad enough. But then to attack the people who were trying to warn the Irish public about the dangers of experimenting with untested drugs, we were attacked relentlessly. I had two separate Gardaí units applied to me. There was days when I had 5 and 6 Gardaí following me around Galway City. I could see them, plain as day that they were Gardaí. We had Kensan applied to us. We had the media applied in a vicious, vicious way. The Irish Independent actually wrote an article that said, one of the first things I had said to Rodney Edwards is, why has your paper not reported on the 25,000 deaths, as it was at the time, on the VAERS register? And he went on in the newspaper article to say, Mr. O'Flaherty challenged me about the deaths, which experts say are not happening. Which experts said that those deaths weren't happening? How could an expert testify to a negative? How could an expert say such a thing when the databases all over the world, the most conservative databases, project 100,000 deaths minimum and 4 million injuries minimum? At the time, the Irish Independent was vilifying me, calling me a liar, and telling the Irish people that those deaths and those injuries were not happening. That is not journalism. That is propaganda. That is narrative peddling. That is selling vaccines. That's terrorising Irish people in their homes. It's a disgrace, and Mr. Edwards and the Irish Independent have a lot to answer for, and so do RTE and their presenters who vilified myself and others like us, who tried to warn the Irish public of the dangers of what they were engaged in.
And a lot of people, Darragh, would say now that, oh, okay, well, the fight's over now. It's gone. COVID is gone.
Well, those are the same people, a lot of those people will be the same people who didn't offer any fight. They were the keyboard warriors who were insisting on evidence and photographs and be dressed in a certain way in order for them to come out onto a platform to speak. They're demanding these details that you see on social media all the time, this pedantic semantics. It's just nonsense. And they provided no presence on the street, but they do interrupt a normal conversation. Like I'm entitled to use the internet, and the people who I work with in a practical way on the ground are entitled to have a forum where we can discuss these topics without this pedantic, semantic excuse making for inaction. So those people who are saying that the fight is over were never in the fight.
Yeah.
They were never in the fight. They were sitting at home in their armchairs doing the armchair general. That's those people. And those people today are telling you that that fight is over because they don't want you making them look bad. You were making them look bad when they were sitting on their backsides doing nothing. And now that you're continuing to pursue accountability for the wrongs that were done to the Irish people, now you're making them look bad again.
Darragh, you mentioned Kinsen. Could you explain to people what Kinsen is?
Well, I wish I could, but I'll make this point. Kinsen was a PR firm that was applied to social media to harvest data from the social media about activists so that that data could be used to either discredit or bring legal ramifications for that person, to tie them up in legal stuff so that they don't have time to actually do their activism. But for me, the real truth of Kinsen was when the Irish government had the cheek to say that they couldn't release the contract because they had lost the contract. The contract had gone missing. That would imply that Kinsen signed a contract and gave the only copy of it to the government. Kinsen's lawyer didn't have a copy of the contract. Kinsen themselves, the operators of Kinsen didn't know what contract they were in. There was only one copy of this contract. When has there ever been one copy of a contract? It's the kind of Romish peddling, excuse making that comes out of our media, and it gives people the opportunity to absolve themselves from responsibility for demanding accountability.
It sounds to me that Kinsen is an information analysis and intelligence firm, and they were obviously paid via our taxpayers' dollar, taxpayers' money. And also I remember during the course of the last 2 years seeing a report, I think it was in The Independent, and it said that a highly secretive Garda unit was assigned to tackle anti-vax protests. Now, when you think of that term, anti-vax protests, right, I think you mentioned that everybody who stood up against that regime was called anti-vax. It's part of the whole labelling. And Dave, you might come in on that later on, in terms of labelling. But why is it, and how could it be acceptable that guardians of the peace, people who are supposed to serve the Irish people, people who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution and to do it with regard to human rights and to treat everybody equally under the law, why were they assigned the National Surveillance Unit to tackle anti-vax protests? It's really bizarre.
Well, you see, the number one thing that they use is fear. So any protest you go to on our side, from our side of the perspective, be it free speech, be it vaccine, be it whatever, you'll always see a big police presence. Now they're all standing there with their hands folded. But what happens is that those photographs and those videos go around and people say, oh, the police are there, oh, I better not go there, the police are involved. you know. Whereas you see other protests and you don't see a Garda at all. So for a lot of Irish people, they don't want trouble with the Gardaí. They will stay as far away from the Gardaí as they can. So even though I genuinely believe, and I'm saying this to the movement, is that the Irish police are smart enough to send the good guards to our protests so that we get into confrontation with actually decent cops. Because I see the look of shame on their faces when we're making speeches, even behind their masks. You can see that it's affecting them. So I'm inclined to think that a lot of the Gardaí that are sent to our protests are actually good cops. And when we get into confrontation, we're actually getting in confrontation with a man who's actually on our side. We talk to these guards and a lot of them are on our side. So if you transfer that then to what the Irish state is notorious for, its overwhelming response to anybody who stands up to it, you know. And that's true in Donegal, the McBreartys, it's true Kevin Wilson. Anybody who has ever stood up to the Irish state ends up in the High Court with massive legal bills. That's the best you can hope for. So whatever response the Irish government had to us, it was going to be overwhelming. It was going to be a lot of resources and a lot of money put into it. And that's all they could come up with, was that we were going to create a police unit to go after people who were exercising their freedoms. We're going to create a police unit to go after people who are counter-narrative, trying to save people from damaging themselves with a chemical experiment, you know.
So thanks a minute. Some of those character groups that, you know, sort of emerged, you had people who were outrightly standing up at great loss sometimes, you know, speaking the truth, censored everywhere they went. You had people who went along fully with everything, wholeheartedly. You had people that were abjectively enforcing all the COVID regulations to the letter and to and beyond the letter. What do you think, both of you guys, is going on in those psyches right now?
Yeah, I mean, one of the hard things is to remember. When we talk about statistics and we talk about all those things, we can get bogged into a position where we are responding to their narrative. We're trying to make sense of what is a load of nonsense, and we get bogged down talking about, and you know, this doesn't teach us anything. So what we have to do is, more and more, we have to paint a simple picture of what this is about. Why is all this nonsense happening? It is, as I said before, it's very important to the World Economic Forum what we think, you know. And so we've just been through 2 years of mind control, of theatre. You know, the masks don't work. Pretty much everybody, that's pretty easily proven. And people generally know that. But this was a little crutch for people to cling to during all of this. And, you know, so it became a religion. I mean, it was a religion. It was a godless death cult, you know. And but it's a godless death cult that everybody participated in. And this is what happens. So this is what they did to us. They got us to do something which we knew was nonsense. But they got us to repeat it, you know, as if it was true. And see, we are agreeing with our own deception there. So what is this all about? Let's go right back to the big picture. What does the World Economic Forum want to do? It wants to get everybody into a little battery hen situation where they can extract eggs out of us and confine us and control our environment so that they know where we are, we're in a surveillance state, and they have to condition us to accept these restrictions. And we're going to be more, and we may or may not be more and more restricted depending on how we respond. So if we reject and oppose all this, we can create more space for ourselves. But if we accept the restrictions, if we accept the nonsense, if we accept the mistruths, if we accept the loss of freedom, we will become essentially restricted through to a cluster in a economic environment which will be a high yield for the globalist super rich. So this is the narrative that we need to get back to. We need to talk about the World Economic Forum wants to limit and restrict you to get a high yield from you in terms of energy, housing. They just want to, you to be a high production battery hen, and that's the simple story of what this is all about. It's and so we, in talking about the World Economic Forum and talking about these restrictions, we have to talk about also what they're trying to restrict us to and what the purpose of that is. And once we start talking about that, it all becomes very clear and very simple and very communicative. Well, but we have to wait for the people to be ready to listen, and that may take a little longer.
Can I just ask you to elaborate on our power here in that situation between us reacting to them and them reacting to us? You spoke about that before to me. I thought it was very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, on a simple level, this is why initiatives, us taking initiatives, is so important, because it means we're taking the offensive. They have a narrative and we need to have a counter narrative. In fact, we need to have the narrative and force them to have the counter narrative against us, because once we are taking the initiative, then they have to respond to us. It gives us power, it gives us choice of direction, it gives us all these things. But once they're taking the initiative and we're responding to that, we're going to lose. There's absolutely no doubt we're going to lose if we are just reactive. So what we have to do is create a whole new structure, a whole new society, and we have to develop that, and we have to envision it, and we have to promote it, and we have to make these ideas clear, well known, and we have to challenge the establishment with our ideas. Why isn't freedom a good idea? Pat Kenny, and Micheál Martin. That's where it has to go back. We have to take it to their doors. We have to take the vision to their doors. So, and it's about taking initiative, and that's why people who went through this, knowing the truth and not acting, there's a huge amount of responsibility and failure there, and what we have to do is provide people with initiatives, because we can't all be specialists, we can't all be experts, we can't all be brainy, but we can provide people with successful initiatives. And once an initiative is successful, like the notices to schools, the hold the lines, everybody can do it. You can roll it out amongst the network. So the network is the most important thing, because the media is not going to, we see we're deplatformed, we see we're cancelled everywhere. So what we have to do is have a physical, knowing relationship with each other in our localities and with the people in the next locality, like we have in the West Coast, like we're developing here. Once we have that, we can roll this vision, these initiatives out, and the activists can take it on and promote it, and we take the offensive back to the establishment.
Brilliant, David. Yeah, I just wanted to come in on something there, and we really need to talk more about initiatives. And when you say an initiative, it means a beginning, and it implies action, something physical. But bringing it back a little bit, when we're talking about reactivity, the difference between reactivity and proactivity. So much of the programming narratives the purpose of them has been to make people react. They've used neurolinguistic programming. You can look it up. It's referred to as NLP. And under that doctrine, there's a phrase called embedded commands. And one of the things they used when they were programming us was vaccine hesitancy. Okay, and don't hesitate. Now, when in any other part of your life was not thinking twice a clever thing to do? I can think of dozens of mistakes I've made where I didn't hesitate and I reacted to something. So you touched on the Russia-Ukraine thing slightly. We have to look at that and what's happening now, and is that the purpose of that to make people react? You know, don't forget, when you're dealing with unknowns, how do you know what is unknown? Well, you look at the past and things that happened in the past. Although it's a different situation, it can give you clues about the unknown. So when whatever was happening in Syria, you know, Aleppo was, somebody released sarin gas over Aleppo, and they blamed it on Assad, and Assad said, obviously I wouldn't have done that, you know, but it caused people to react in such a way that it justified Russia and China arming and fighting on Assad's side, and, you know, the EU and America and the Brits fighting on the rebel side, and it justified that. And now we have this really, really unbalanced programming narrative coming from the mainstream media about the situation in Russia and Ukraine. And if you'd like to talk about that, Dara, what are we not understanding with the fog of war?
Indeed, and it's the same thing that we didn't understand in the fog of COVID. And it's a simple principle. People don't do things for reasonable reasons. They do things for emotional reasons. And it doesn't matter what you look at. It's not until it becomes an emotional concern that someone will react. So this is one of the reasons why all of the logic and statistics and facts we gave people during the pandemic didn't work. It's because they were in an emotional state and they were reacting emotionally, and no amount of logic and reason will penetrate that. So then we I don't know how they were able to flip it in the space of 2 weeks, but they turned all the hate that was against the people who refused to engage in the chemical experiment. They turned that towards Russians, not just Putin. The whole, even expat Russians in other countries are being hated upon. Terrible things that were being said, very similar to the things that were said about the people who refused to partake in the pandemic narrative. You know, put them in camps, force them out of society, cancel them, take away their job, take away their enforced poverty on them. It's exactly the same stuff, except this time it wasn't directed at individuals. They directed cancel culture at a country, at a nation, at a people. And it's really, that's one of the most terrifying things of what I've seen so far in the Ukrainian war. Sure, there's atrocities, absolutely, but to see the way the larger public were swung around on a 90-degree turn and just took all the venom that they were about to direct at their governments and their media over the damage that had been caused by the pandemic and the subsequent vaccine program. They just turned that on the Russians, just like that, and they said they used emotional triggers. The sovereignty all of a sudden Michal Martin was talking about. You know, that has to be one of the biggest flip-flops in the history of the planet, even, you know, to go from in Ireland where people were sovereign and free to being told that you were backward and ignorant, and now we're back to protecting the sovereign people of Ukraine. How is it that guns are bad in America and guns are bad in Ireland, but the Ukrainians need guns? How is it that people spent 2 years in their house giving away not only their own freedoms, but my freedoms? Happy to see me put in a camp, happy to see me injected with an experimental chemical. And then when something happens in Ukraine, they're saying, arm the Ukrainians and let them go out and fight and die for their country. Well, where were they? Why weren't they dying for their country and their freedoms for the last 2 years? Well, why were they inside their houses terrified for 2 years, letting their government take their freedoms away? And who are they to tell Ukrainians what to do now? Who are they to tell anybody what to do now in the case of a war or anything like that, you know? So it's very, I think it's gone to another level now, this NLP. It's actually just another name for brainwashing. When people say brainwashing, when we say brainwashing, we mean NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming. It is very real and it is very, very effective. Build back better. This is Neuro-Linguistic Programming. We don't want to build back better. The thing we had was just fine. We want the thing we had even 20 years ago. I want that. Gaelic revival, right?
Yeah, the Gaelic revival. I mean, the great thing about this whole process is that this process challenges people, and if they have enough ethics and logic, if there's a morality left after all the dumbing down, after all the breaking down of structures and traditions, the framework on which we base our understanding of life, which was traditional nation, our understanding of ourselves, and our spirituality, which is our understanding of eternity and the world and time and space. Now guys are being challenged. What do you believe? How do you believe? Because you were talking about China and Russia for Assad, and the European Union and the democratic America for the other guys. But included in that was the Islamic extremists. They were opposing Assad. And the same here with Ukraine. You've got the Ukrainian Nazis opposing Russia. So that challenges people. And we hoped that with the whole Islamic thing, that people would think, hold on here, what's going on? There's an obvious contradiction between our liberal world and Islam. And they didn't get that. They just hidden hope with that, and dismissed any attention that was coming to, there's an enormous friction here, this is not going to work. And then you've got the same thing here with Ukraine and the clear Azov brigades, this tradition of Nazism and ethnic cleansing of 100,000 Polish people in the Wolin province, which is now occupied by Ukraine and Ukrainians. And, this is a massive challenge to all those lefty liberals who jumped on the on the bandwagon, both the our centrist government, who is promoting this all over the place, and the traditional anti-NATO, anti-war left. So they're now going, hold on, these guys, which is us, who we've been calling names, cancel culture, they are the devil, they are Hitler, they are that. All of a sudden they're saying, hold on, we're not supporting Russia, but we're not supporting Ukrainian, ethnic cleansers either. And they're going, I agree with that. There's something wrong. There's something wrong with me. My hostility to these guys is not sustainable. Is not arguable. So this is actually a good thing, but it requires people to listen. And this is the big thing. And that's why the cancel culture and the shutdown of media, the deplatforming, they can only do it that way because people are so dumbed down. The stances people are taking are so childishly foolish that they really have to stop all information getting to people. And if the information gets through, we're going to see this whole thing fall apart. And it'll fall apart. I believe it'll fall apart very quickly. I think our era is the next 5 years. I think we have a great 5 years ahead of us.
Brilliant. Probably the last maybe open-ended question on the whole Russia-Ukrainian thing, and then we might go talk more about the initiatives. But we've seen a lot of media proving that there are very strong Nazi groups in Ukraine, paramilitary groups in Ukraine, and
that were trained in America and Canada. They were actually brought from the Ukraine and trained by the CIA in both America and Canada. They returned back to Ukraine and then some of them went back to America and committed terror attacks using the training the CIA had given them.
Well, here's the question. I mean, I spoke with the lady, and she said, well, that couldn't be true because Zelensky is apparently of Jewish heritage, and there's this real eagerness to explain it away with some other thing. Well, if that's true, this can't be true. But we've seen the proof that there are those links there. And now we're probably going to be importing tens and thousands of refugees who no doubt need humanitarian aid. Like, don't get me wrong there, they no doubt need humanitarian aid. But the question is it now racist of us that those refugees are screened for Nazi extremism? And whose responsibility is it if we import Nazi extremism unchecked into Ireland?
Just before we answer that question, I have to go back to the Zelensky point.
Sure.
But that Zelensky is a Jew, therefore he couldn't be a Nazi. So what that is a heuristic. It's a simple phrase that allows people to divert away from a huge topic, such as CIA training of Nazis all over the world. This is a gigantic topic that NATO have been financing and arming Nazi groups all over the world since World War II. And you can't just dismiss that. There was court cases in Italy, Austria, Germany. They were all over Europe, these court cases, when they discovered these rings. And to turn around and say, well, Zelensky is a Jew, so none of it's real. That's nonsense. They're not equivalent amounts of information. So what they do is they put something emotional in front of you that you can latch onto. So if you went against Zelensky, you'd be a anti-Semite. So now you're caught in that emotional dilemma or that moral dilemma, and you can't examine this whole raft of evidence. I mean, it's enormous. The depth of the Nazi conspiracy in Ukraine. 10% of the fighting force in the Maidan Revolution were Nazis. But that 10% were the 90% of the effective fighting force. So it was officially a Nazi revolution in the Ukraine. And the Nazi brigade, the Azov brigade said themselves, if the Maidan Revolution had happened without them, it would basically have been a gay pride parade. That's their own words. Yeah. And since then, they've got ministers in the government. They've taken over aspects of the civil service. And that was done with the blessing, financing, and arming of the CIA, NATO, and the Zelensky and the other man's name, Poroshenko. Or not Poroshenko, the first president. There was an interim president from the CIA before Zelensky. So sorry, I just wanted to clear that up. Yeah. To say that because Zelensky is a Jew, then there couldn't be Nazis is absolutely nonsense. We know that there were many Jews in the SS and throughout Hitler's army. There were all different kinds of Jews. The Jews that we know personally, I've worked for many Jews over the years, and they were very generous people. Some of the best people I've worked for have been Jews, the kind of guys who buy you your dinner in the middle of the day, just good people. You find good people everywhere. But unfortunately, every culture seems to have these imperialist or supremacist aspects to them, which is quite alien to the west of Ireland anyway. This idea that supremacy is like what do we feel supreme about? What is it I credit an Irishman with that I couldn't credit an Englishman with? So the idea of Irish supremacy is what?
And I think you know what you said. If you look at the whole Antifa thing, it's like, well, I'm anti-fascist, so therefore I can use fascism to fight my ideological opponents. And why I'm supreme is because I'm moral. So it's like I wrote the book on Humble, So
I mean, you pretty much said everything. I wanted to say that Julian Assange said our number one enemy is ignorance. And a lack of appreciation of the integral nature of things and the sophistication of a thing just leads you to this, this war being a soccer match, which is being played out, and you support a team. You pick red or blue. And that's we have to get away from that. And with there was nascent gypsy movements too in the 1930s, and because they were traditional type communities, they tended to support Mussolini and also Franco. So traditional ethnic groups with a strong sense of heritage tend to be conservative anyway. So they are always going to gravitate to a more national identity, and that can be manipulated as it was in the Second World War. So I don't think we need to screen people. I think we have to be very aware of the process which leads people from having pride in themselves to ethnic cleansing and murder and mayhem. The two things are not the same. And so we've got to draw we've got to separate the whole issue out and chop it up and look at it, see how this happens. Because if we don't understand it, it's going to happen again. And it is moving that way, but it can be stopped. It can be stopped by intelligence, reason, logic, history. History, so important.
Brilliant. we could talk about this at length. Going to initiatives, right? I think that group of people that we discussed that knew the conscience was niggling at them. This isn't right, but you know they might have had this other inner dialogue that said, "Well, what can you do about it? You're just a person," you know. And I think a lot of people have to realise that the true power of the individual, but also the very fact that you knew, if you're listening at home, you knew something was wrong. You had that knowledge. Knowledge is power. And in the words of Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Okay, so we have this knowledge now. And we also have this knowledge in the Russia-Ukraine thing that something isn't right, that we're lacking the balance. We're only getting one side. And if that's the only piece of knowledge you have, you are still very powerful, but it means you have a responsibility. So how does that responsibility fit into an initiative? What can you do if you're only an individual?
Well, I feel very strongly about the power of the individual, and every Republican should. Republicanism, the basis of republicanism is the rights of an individual. And if you look after the individual, then everybody else will be grand. So the whole basis of our country, republicanism, is individuals acting. Now in this case, you were told you couldn't leave your house, and you were told you couldn't go to the shop, and you couldn't go visit this person and that person. So for the first time, we were expected to oppose tyranny without our basic natural rights. So that was new, and it caught people off guard, and we weren't prepared for it. But actually, what turned out to be the protest was not staying in your house, going to Dublin, going to Limerick, going to these places. That in itself was an act of protest, a defiance. Not complying is an act of defiance. I understand that people were in difficult positions with their families and such, and that people were terrified. But in a case of fear, you have to be the individual who retains their composure. So we get into these spats on the internet and all that. But if you were approaching your family with Bible thumping COVID statistics, you never had a chance of getting through them. There was no way to do that. And I saw someone talk about it yesterday. If you're trying to convince somebody of your position or move somebody towards your position, really what you're not trying to convince them of your position. You're trying to give them a better understanding of the way that you think, or the way that you think about a topic. And even if you can improve their understanding by 1%, you've started them on a journey where they can improve their understanding of the topic. So.
Yeah, I think we need to live by the truth. I think that it goes now as an individual. I mean, the groups of people we have generally supporting us, we can identify three rough groups. One is Christians, with a moral structure. You have pagans who have a, environmental understanding, and nature teaches a lot. And then we have ethical and moral people who are intellectually driven by learning from the past. And, those people need to exercise their sovereign individual citizenship. We do have rights. We do have freedoms. We have to resist lawlessness. The two things we need is to challenge on the law and the media. So this may be a good time to talk about. I mean, Dara's great on the law, but on a big picture, what I see is that we are a lawless society now. The lawlessness is not coming from below; it's coming from the top. Our national constitution has been overridden by recommendation. We are ruled by recommendations from international bodies. How did that happen? Where is the accountability? There is none. And because they can't account, the courts have to dodge everything. They are just, the courts are behaving as pure chancers, shoving everything down the road, dodging, avoiding the obvious, with complex, structures and complex thoughts and words. But our constitution there are legal challenges to the Constitution which have been kicked down the road, and they're going to keep on coming. They know when they criminalise the ordinary citizen that they're creating a massive backlog in the courts, and that's what they're seeing now. The courts are becoming unworkable because every time you pass a corrupt law, and I think it was some Greek scholar was saying, the more corrupt the system, the more laws they pass, and that's what we're seeing now. Laws being passed, and the courts can't cope because it's not virtuous. This is pure tyranny, and you can't make a system out of that. It's just force and bullying. You can't create law and justice out of that. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is media. We have to live our truth and speak it and challenge it. So we have to reclaim our words. We have to speak our narrative. We have to challenge their narrative and come up with our own. Like, the World Economic Forum wants to turn you into a battery hen. That is a story we have to tell. We have to reclaim our words, like tolerance. We are tolerant. They are intolerant. Diverse. We accept diverse opinions and we're listening to them. They aren't. So we are diverse. We are tolerant. We are anti-fascist. We are inclusive. We have an inclusive national vision which we can include people into. And we can talk about that. We can talk about what is happening now, which is something we can't include colonization, because that is not inclusive. We can't include 20% new arrivals, because the biggest indicator of social conflict for the future is population change, population migration. That is the biggest indication of future conflict. That is not a situation. You can't do all your diversity and inclusion with that because the numbers are too great, and there is no actual integration happening. If you go to London, it's lots of little colonies of populations, and so we want an inclusive society. We want an inclusive Irish nationalism. It has always happened that people have come to Ireland and have integrated, and in fact our greatest weapon is that we do integrate people into our society. But when you have 20% newcomers like you did with the Protestants, the plantation, it takes 400 years for us to process that because there's a conflict, and if these people are used in a way to undermine us, to create high house prices and all these kind of things to be used against us, and aren't taught to identify us and are taught to compete against us, then we've got conflict. And but we don't want that. We want inclusion, we want diversity, we want anti-fascism, and we want tolerance. And democracy, two opposing opinions, two opposing choices can't be included in society without tolerance. That is the root of democracy. We believe in all of that, and we need to reclaim all that language. And that's where we need to go, and we need to get comfortable talking about
David, there's some really interesting things there, and I think if we're honest about it, back in the past, maybe when I was growing up, there were some overtones of racism in Irish society, and I think what people have to remember is that the natural antidote to racism, because racism is born in ignorance, it's just fear of the unknown. And the more different from you a person is, the more fear there is, So, and we see that with different accents in different counties in Ireland, Yeah. And the more colourful your accent gets or your skin gets, the more different you are. And the natural antidote to that is nationalism. We all remember when we were kids growing up, every single Paddy's Day parade, you'd have Indian people, you'd have African people, all in their cultural garb and singing their cultural songs and celebrating Irishness, celebrating that banner. And I think there's a lot of conflict in different types of movements, people who spoke out against what was happening. And when they were at their most cohesive, when they were working the best together, was when they had a common enemy. And the common enemy was medical coercion that was coming for everybody. And since that has been slightly lifted temporarily, a lot of those different groups are beginning to squabble again. And what we need to realise is the common enemy, that banner that's going to unite us again, is what the greater plan is with the World Economic Forum. It's to make it so as nobody can afford to have a family, so as nobody can afford to have a house, so as nobody can afford to travel from A to B, so as those rights of the individual to become dissipated, favouring the rights of the government, favouring the interests of the government. And this really is going to hit our pockets, and we need to unite, I think, under that banner.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is ownership and agency, and that's what gives us a nation. And I'm very reluctant, actually. I think race is a word we also have to reclaim. I'm reluctant to talk about sexism and racism because I have a sex, it's male. And, I need to defend my interest as a man. And that saying, love your neighbour as yourself, unless you love yourself, how can you love your neighbour? If you're full of hate and anger, and disappointment and rejection and all that, how are you're just gonna project that onto other people. So I need to love myself, I need to have an Irish heroic self-image of me, an Irish man, and I should be proud of that, because that's what projects confidence and belief, purpose and vision into my environment and my community. That's what makes me a leader, and we need leaders, So when it comes to race, I'm an Irishman. I have a little bit of diversity in there too, and I'm pretty high up on the critical race theory thing when it comes to it. But by and large, I'm mostly an Irish person with Gaelic roots who identifies with that strongly, and I shouldn't have to, in the same way as I promote my own family, I promote my community, I promote my county, I promote my nation, and that's what defends me against the World Economic Forum, who wants to take away my ownership, wants to take away my agency by not allowing me ownership of my identity, of my country, of the environment, the laws, that my agency to be able to exercise my ownership, my ownership of my country, to travel its roads, to do those things. And so no, I'm not giving up those things, and that's right, And I think when you're talking about the Paddy's Day parade, yes, and we saw the one or two Chinese people there, or the African guy in the parade, and we were delighted to share our ownership with that person. And I think that they respected and appreciated the honour that they were given. I don't think when you have mass migration that there is that appreciation and honour. And I think that if you were to talk to the guy who was the one African guy in the parish, back then, and ask him about how it is now, he would way prefer when it was back then. He would way prefer when he had a chance of integration into the heart of Irish society, where he would be a real part of our community and not a ghettoised, exploited servant in an imperial system of the World Economic Forum.
Yeah. Well, I remember doing a course some years ago in social studies. And one of the things in intercultural studies they were talking about was when migration happens in such a scale, in such a large scale, over a shorter period of time, assimilation is not possible. And we have to realise what's in it for us and what's in it for them for that to be happening in the country of Ireland. So if you get a bunch of people from a totally different country and you they immigrate in mass here, they become sort of colonized and they self-colonize. And what happens is they can't integrate into society. And what does that lead to? It leads to drug abuse, because those people are unhappy. You know, and they might have their own individual culture sets, but it leads to drug abuse. It leads to mental health decline. And what have we seen being inflicted in the local Irish people by pockets of people who came in and didn't have the support of the assimilation of society? We've seen a lot of rapes. We've seen a lot of very violent attacks. And we're not saying that this is to do with the person's race. We're saying this is to do, well, I'm saying in my own opinion, is that bringing people in a grandiose way in which assimilation can happen contributes to that, you know.
Yeah, I mean, Dara, do you want to say anything?
Well, I just wanted to say, what's in it for the Irish people, you know?
That's where we need to
So, you know, we spoke about, I think the carbon aspect was a good demonstration of what is generally perceived as the benefit of a lot of these ridiculous narratives. So the point was made that even if Ireland stopped making all the carbon, Ireland didn't produce a single gram of carbon from now forever, it wouldn't make any difference to global carbon production. It's 0.0001% of all carbon produced is produced in Ireland. So what is in that whole scenario for the Irish people? And it turns out their response when challenged, the government challenged, when the environmentalists were challenged, is that they said we would be setting a good example for the world. So they literally admitted that the whole environmental movement based around carbon in Ireland is about virtue signaling.
Honor system.
You know, it's about showing the world how good a person you are. We're going to leave our grandmothers and our grandfathers freezing in their houses because we need to show the world how pleasant we are and how nice we are. Yeah. That is not a way to run a country. That is not how you manage resources. And I just wanted to say about racism as well. My own particular view of race and racism, having been all over the world. I've lived all over the world. I lived in Australia with Aborigine communities. They were my only source of food, shelter, money. I was completely dependent on these communities. I was dependent on black African American communities in America. So I have a long history and pedigree of supporting those communities, indigenous communities, in their locations. And very proud of it, you know. Some of the work I done out there was kind of what would be seen as health work, you know. So for me, racism has always been about when one group identifies another group and starts to discriminate against them. And that's the level at which a government or a police force should be involved. When it's one individual attacking another individual, that's not somewhere a government should be involved. That's two people saying the most hurtful stuff they can say to each other, to be as nasty as possible in an argument. And you cannot regulate that at government level. If you do that, you end up living in tyranny.
Yeah.
You know. The other aspect of racism is that you cannot, in a republic, you cannot give groups rights. If you give a group rights, that group will be tyrannical towards the individual. That's just how it is, you know. So in republicanism, we give individuals rights, and every individual, regardless of race, it doesn't matter what race you are, it doesn't matter what your mental abilities are, it doesn't matter what your work capabilities are. If your individual rights are protected, you will not be subject to racism. It's as simple as that. And there's nowhere I've ever come across in the Irish system, I've come across a huge amount of corruption. I've come across all kinds of horribleness in the Irish system, but I cannot say that I've ever seen a concerted effort by the Irish people to be racist. You know?
No, I don't think so. And I think, you know, when this all started, I mean, Ireland was pretty much one of the most cohesive environments. There was very few strangers here. And that has been going on for a very, very long time. People say, oh, we were always one of the most isolated populations. And so when we started, I mean, I was certainly in London for a long time. What we were fighting for years ago was inclusive nationalism. We were fighting discrimination so that we could have an inclusive nationalism, so that people could be part of our nation. But then things changed, and a lot of us who used to be kind of lefty types started to realise we're not fighting for integration anymore. We're fighting against colonization. We're starting to have to defend ourselves. So, and this is what the World Economic Forum is promoting for the ordinary Irish man and woman, is first, Extinction Rebellion. You're a scourge on the planet. You deserve nothing. Your ownership of Ireland means nothing. You have no right to it in the future. You know, you need to be gone. You know, then the second one is the whole green agenda. You know, which is you know, you need to not own, you know, your ownership of the land is a problem. You need to be in your little box in a cluster. You know, that sense of belonging in your natural environment is not something for you because you're a person. You know, the animals are are more important than you. And finally, BLM, you know, which is, there are other people who are going to be here to cause you to compete with them for high rents, to act as a supply generator of high rents, and you are not to resist them. You are not to defend yourself. You're not to defend yourself under all these attacks on your money, on your income, on what we exploit from you. And this is a setup for, and we have changed from people who wanted to include people in something we owned and something we had control in, to now fighting to retain ownership and control of our own environment. And that's the future for us now. And when you talk about drugs, you know, this is what happens. You know, this is the reality that, you know, and this is one of the problem with Irish people. You know, you cannot take refuge in drugs. You cannot take refuge in a world of addiction, because what will happen is that every time you buy your illegal drugs, you are supporting largely foreign gangs to take ownership of your working class communities. And also for the girls, you know, there is a lack of respect there. These girls are at risk. You know, our Irish girls will be at risk from the power that the foreign gang member has over their communities. And that would be an abusive relationship. And all over the west of Europe, we've seen a car crash between traditional communities, traditional cultures like the Muslim culture, who haven't got any respect. They have very strong morals and structures, and we admire that. You know, we think that's the way to go. But it gives them a power in these broken down, you know, familyless, structureless mess that, you know, that degeneracy has created on our own society and culture, which wasn't here 30 years ago. But it gives them massive power to exploit our working class communities, and we have to defend against that. And all over Western Europe, we're seeing, you know, let's spell it out. The rape figures in Paris, Stockholm, all these places, more than half of the rapes are being committed by 3 to 5% of the population. You know, and we have to talk about that. This is, you know, this is unavoidable, and this is human nature too. Yeah.
What would so many of what we've discussed here and in the last few minutes, the climate change agenda, you know, the demonization of carbon output, race, all these sexism, all these things that are being used as tools to silence people, and that's the real topic that we're going to get our teeth into now, is censorship. And it really is the Leviathan. It's that great monster that is stopping us from providing the balance. And people need to realize, I think people innately realize that when they're hearing one side of an argument repeated and repeated and repeated, something inside them is telling them that there's something else, there's something not being said. And that's what we really have to fight against. You know, and I'll share a little quote with you. ideas are more powerful than weapons. We don't let our enemies have weapons, so why would we let them have ideas? And that's Joseph Stalin said that. So what we have to realize where censorship is going to bring us, you know, and let's apply it to ourselves. Let's apply it to the other people in the movement. What is the danger of censoring our ideological opponents? You know, it means we think we're right. We're not right all the time. You know, it means we don't understand them. And so much of conflict resolution centers around understanding your opponent. So, how do we fight censorship? What do we do?
Well, the number one weapon against censorship is, first of all, to identify the type of censorship that is most pernicious. And unfortunately, it's self-censorship. You've been conditioned over 2 decades now with Facebook, Twitter, all that social media. You know, it's people restrict, they have the idea in their head and they don't allow themselves to say it because of the social consequences that will be imposed on them. And they're not even real social consequences. They're Facebook social consequences. They're Instagram social consequences. So people were coached into creating these images of themselves online, where before you had a professional working in an executive position in a factory, and he had an image that he projected inside his workplace, and that's how things were done. That became transferred onto Facebook, where everybody had a kind of a professional image that they had in their job, and anything that happened on their Facebook page would affect their job. So this is really, really dangerous, you know, where we're now so afraid that anybody would react badly to anything that we say, we don't speak our minds. And Ireland, this is our greatest talent in this country, is our speech. We are brilliant with it. Comedy destroys tyranny. Slagging tyrants drives them berserk. And you need to remember what you're looking at now around the world is actually the collapse of this tyranny. This is why they've become so irrational. This is why they've become so crazy, why you have anti-war protesters demanding you arm Ukrainians. It's because their world is collapsing and they're becoming more desperate. They're grabbing at anything they can to exercise their power. Whereas on the other hand, when you're self-censoring, you're failing to actualize yourself in the world. It leads you to frustration, it leads you to depression, it leads you to inaction. So they're the two sides of the coin. We have one group over-expressing themselves and getting themselves into trouble, and the other group not expressing themselves at all and getting themselves into trouble.
I mean, that's it. There's conflict between self-control and self-expression. And like you say, one group have all the expression and the others are expected to control themselves all the time. You know, and going back to the working class European neighbourhoods, you know, they're expected to self-censor. They're expected always to control themselves, to not get angry. And, you know, they are being atomized, they're being broken up, they're being exploited. And, you know, these are the people who are apparently the bad guys, you know. And so what we know they're not. You know, these are our guys. These are us. That is me. You know, where is my Gaelic heroic self-image now? We need a Gaelic revival. You know, we need to give everybody a purpose and a vision where they can work towards a vision which will benefit them. You know, what we're seeing is the ordinary Irish person is being asked to take his hands off his ownership of his country, of his identity, of his future, of his family, of all these things. You know, he's been asked to let go of all his dreams. He's in order to facilitate whatever else. But we need to put the crown back on that man's head, that woman's head, and say, you are master of your own destiny. This is your place. This is your environment, and it is for your benefit. You know, and we've got to reverse that whole. Essentially, what's happened with the World Economic Forum is what happened with the British Empire. What we've got to do is what happened with the Age of Saints and Scholars, where people came from all over the post-Roman world to Ireland, and they participated in a Gaelic vision, for a Gaelic purpose, for the benefit of Ireland. What we're seeing now is we're all being expected to yield our resources and people towards somebody else's vision, for somebody else's purpose, for somebody else's benefit around the other side of the world. And that's got to change. We've got to get back to putting the crown on the ordinary Irishman's head and saying, here is the Gaelic revival, here is the Age of Saints and Scholars again, this is how we do it. We have an Irish purpose and an Irish vision for the benefit of Ireland and everybody here, you know, which is an inclusive nationalism. You know, we're all expected to work towards this for our benefit. And so that's the difference, and that's what we have to pursue. Now, censorship is going to, and deplatforming, we're going to be deplatformed all the way, because we're told, you know, that's something which you could probably take. Yeah. I don't want to talk too much about it. You could probably share some light on it.
Well, I have a couple of ideas, and you know, I'll lay those out, and then we might kind of finish around the final question, and I'll give it to you now, and just have a think about it. What do people need to know? What do people need to remember? What needs to salinate in their minds? You know, so when it comes to censorship, I think we were talking about reactive measures and proactive measures. And I think speaking the truth is both of those. But if you find something that you know we're being lied about, and that you know there's unbalanced, and when you go and speak the truth about it outwardly, you're both reacting to what is being done, and you're proactive in addressing it. You have to realise where the censorship is taking place. It's taking place online, and it's taking place in these other realms. My father taught me when I was a young man. He said, Rob, when the chips are down, you work with what you have. We have to realise that. What do we have? Okay, you have a physical body. You probably have a device that you're looking at this on that can access the internet. It can ring the other people in your communities. You have people in your communities, and that's the power of the individual. Those people know other people. Those people know other people. And you'll find all across Ireland, there are networks of people unified by their actions. They stood up when it mattered. They spoke the truth when they had something to lose. And they're the people who you want to use what you have, your body, your telecommunication devices, the skill of writing, and you want to communicate with those people. And they can lend initiatives. And it also helps that communication, you know. So yeah, I suppose that's it really. Work with what you have, yeah. and find something where you know that the truth isn't getting out there, and that there's an unbalance, and tackle it, and reach out to those people in your community, because there's no Facebook, there's no fact checker there to say, oh, hold on, this, that, and the other, and all those real things that are being used to beat us down and to take our sovereignty and to take our franchise away from us, and you know, to intimidate you into speaking up for yourself. The truth is the antidote to all those, and they're all being governed by censorship. So yeah, what do you men think people really need to remember, and really needs to stick with them when they're moving forward?
Well, yeah, first thing everybody should remember is that you're an Irish person. Now, whether it is you're from another nation and you came here and imbibed our nation and married an Irish person and had half Irish kids, and or whatever, you know, as long as you came here from another nation with respect for this nation, you can be part of this nation. If not this generation, the next generation. Okay? So this is not an exclusive thing. This is an inclusive thing, and it's for everybody, and it's as important to protect the Irish nation as it is your own nation. If one nation goes, if nationalism goes worldwide, it's over. If one nation falls to this, they all fall. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you have a very, very rich heritage that you should be very, very, very proud of. And that is what they're after. They're trying to lobotomize your heritage out of your brain and take those memories of great Irish people throughout the ages away from you and make you feel isolated in your home. And, you know, our ancestors created an image of what Ireland, they wanted Ireland to be. So we don't need a new image of Ireland. We know what our ancestors wanted. We know what our Constitution originally said, you know. We know what the Declaration of Independence said. We don't need a whole new raft of ideas. They're there already. They were never implemented properly. Even going forward, we don't even need new laws. We just need people who are willing to enforce the laws that are already there. So we haven't got a huge amount of work to do other than have conviction in your beliefs, have conviction in your actions. Be proud of yourself as an Irish person and what we bring to the nations and what we bring to the world. Because the world loves us. The world loves Ireland. The world loves Irish people. They look to us as a form of their conscience. We don't have a big army and we don't have like aircraft carriers. But nobody really wants to have Irish people wagging their finger at them. You know, we have power in our influence. We punch way above our weight in our influence. And remember that. And it's you and your ancestors that put us there.
Yeah, I mean, what do we have now? You put it very well, and I don't want to go over the cultural stuff again, even though I love it all. I think there's, what do we have? We have a network of individuals who don't necessarily agree with each other, who oppose a common enemy. You know, we have a common objective. And like you said, we have our own culture, and it's a culture which is very much an environmental culture. We were a clan system that lasted into the 17th century, so or even later. And so when Europeans look at us, they're looking at their past. They're looking at the European who is a native man, who is comfortable with his own environment, not destroying it, working with it, being comfortable in it. So, you know, we have a model which is well worth people taking note of, and which is in opposition to what is happening, this radical restructuring of our economy and our society. But what do we have? We have a network of individuals that are more active than any other political force at the moment in the state. We are more active on the ground than Sinn Féin. And that is a credit to us, you know, to what we've achieved and what we've done. And our actions are having a real effect on what is happening at the moment. The narrative which the government is putting out into all its little arms into our society. What was that group you were talking about earlier, Dara? The global.
Oh, the global shapers.
Yeah, global shapers, and you've got the other crowd, which are the global shapers are the people who are, set up the NGOs, all those groups which try to transform the thinking of our society. You know,
paid financed groups
Yeah.
that are operating in all of our communities around, not just Ireland, all over the world, paid for by the WEF, Klaus Schwab, and that set have their agents. They're paid agents. They get involved in every community activity
Yeah.
that they can possibly get involved in, and they direct it in a way that would please Mr. Schwab.
but we do this for nothing. You know, we have sacrificed, we've been arrested, we are before the courts. All those things never happen to them, you know. So we have achieved an awful amount. And as this, in quotes, pandemic is finished, we're in a different environment. So what we need to do is keep the momentum going. Those guys are expecting us to disappear off the stage now, as if we've got what we want. But the World Economic Forum has not finished with us yet. They haven't got us into our battery cages. So they're going to carry on. And I was worried that our momentum would go. But I don't think so. I think listening to people that they are prepared to continue. So what we have to do is, what have we got? We've got each other. We don't have, and we have our constitution. We have the Irish Republic. We have our inheritance from those guys who sacrificed in 1916 to, who saw a nation being starved to death and who complied with their own destruction because they were so powerless. And we don't want to get into that position where we're so powerless again. And we recognize that that's what they're trying to maneuver us into, that position. So we stand by our rights, we stand by our republic, we stand by our freedoms, we stand by our nations, we stand by our counties, by our parishes, and by our families, And so we also reject degeneracy, So there is a model for Irish youth where, which is an anti-family, drug-induced, degenerate, mutant image of what we should be, and we need to recognize that the drug pop culture aspiration is our enemy. And what Assange was saying when he said our number one enemy is ignorance, because we don't recognize what is happening. We don't recognize what is happening to us at the moment. And that is what a whole generation of people are experiencing. But I think that they know that something is up. The dissatisfaction and what Dara said at the beginning, our youth, we didn't realize how traumatized and how sad they were, how isolated and how intimidated they were. And so we have to empower the youth. We have to give them, ask them to give their own selves permission to hope for a future. And I think it's that bad, that they almost need to be given permission to take hold of their lives. And we give them that permission. Take hold of your lives. We give them that instruction. We give them that hope, and we give them that environment. And we push back on all the things which say that your life is worthless. You are a very precious person with a purpose in this world. You are not to be abused and discarded. And you are a person who deserves respect, and we want to give you agency in your own life. That means control, opportunity, and ownership of your own life. And so that's where we have to go. And I think that's what we can give people. I think we have to recognize too that they hate you. The government, our Irish government, which is there just to deliver us into the World Economic Forum system, hates you. They wish no good at all. And I think everybody has to recognize that. And I think that may be where we need to end up. They hate you.
Could I just address drug pop culture? Only because I come from Galway and drug pop culture is quite popular. So the Galway I grew up in was a very free place, very creative, very spiritual. And I watched as so many of my friends and contemporaries descended into drug addiction and alcohol addiction, because there was no place in their world for their view of how things should be. There was no place in the world for their view of freedom, for their view of health, for their view of spirituality. So they went into a hole of drug addiction and alcohol addiction to protect themselves from the cruelty of the world. So I want to say to those people who I grew up with and are in that place, now is your time. Now is the time that you were put here on this earth to be alive for, not to be drugged up for. I know the last 20 and 40 years were impossible to live with. But now at this moment, your freedom and your understanding of the problems that we suffered all through those years is needed. We need you out here beside us on the street.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Dara, and thanks everybody for sticking the course, and thank you, particular men, for having the courage to speak about things that are being censored. And you know, courage really is the antidote to censorship. I'd like to speak about very briefly, just in conclusion, about courage and the conscience, because there ought to have been, you know, some people have expressed shame about how the Irish reacted to this, and I've expressed that myself at times. You know, we really rammed it all home, and we governed ourselves, and we were the prison guards of the COVIDian narrative. And I remember when I was speaking out about the medical coercion, somebody, you know, the natural thing was, well, you don't have a medical degree. And the point was, you don't need a medical degree to tell the difference between right and wrong. Your conscience ought to be doing that for you, unless, of course, you've subdued it. You've subdued that conscience by your acts. That's how it's done. And that word conscience will transcend all the different religious cultures. It's the moral compass that's within. Yeah. You know, and so that's your weapon. That's your silver bullet. If you're a human being and you have a physical body and you have the gift of speech and you can write and you have a device that you can communicate outward with, and you're a node in a network, you know people who know people, and most importantly, you have a conscience. That's your silver bullet. That's how you discern what is right and wrong, and that is how you fight censorship. So this has been a really powerful episode around the chessboard. Thank you very much, guys.
You're welcome.